Hi, my name is Brittany Hunley. Welcome to this video, Religion, Sex, and Shame, Reclaiming Sacred Sexuality. If you were taught that your sexuality made you sinful, this is the video for you. The goal of this video is to explore how major world religions originally held sex as sacred, how shame-based teachings emerged, and how individuals can begin to heal religious sexual shame. This is a very heavy topic, and we're going to talk about several religions in a very basic way. If at any time you become overwhelmed by this education, please set it aside and reach out for support. Let's talk about how religious sexual shame is cultural, not divine. Most faiths originally regarded sex as sacred. It's the interpretation of sacred texts, not scripture, that changed that. So let's look at a common thread across many religions. Sacred sexuality was the norm in ancient religious and spiritual practices. Fertility, embodiment, pleasure, all of that was regarded as divine. The patriarchy, colonization, and power structures shaped modern teachings to suppress sexuality, especially in women, LGBTQIA plus folks, and unmarried people. The message here is the problem isn't faith. It's shame-based control. Let's look at some major religions and sexuality. Christianity and Catholicism. So the original text in the Old Testament, Song of Solomon, celebrates erotic love. Genesis frames sex as good. The early church, sex was for connection and pleasure, not just procreation. And it shifted when Augustine and Paul emphasized sin, celibacy, and separated the body from the spirit. There are a lot of Christian teachings that caused sexual shame, like the purity culture, which talked a lot about modesty and modest is hottest, and abstinence only sex education, virginity as a virtue, daughters pledging their virginity to their fathers in purity ceremonies and exchanging rings with their fathers. There were also a lot of LGBTQIA plus condemnation that came from Christian teachings, and women's pleasure being pretty much completely overlooked or even demonized. So to reclaim this under Christian upbringing, progressive theology like Matthew Vines, Nadia Bolt-Weber, Father Richard Rohr, that's Rohr, and feminist and queer Christian interpretations have to be reached out to keep separating God from guilt. Judaism. So in the original text of Judaism, the Talmud, it encouraged marital sex, female pleasure, oneg Shabbat, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, which includes sex on the Sabbath as a prescription. Orthodox traditions began to emphasize modesty, but also view sex as a mitzvah, a good deed. There are sources of shame that contributed to Judaism losing its sex as sacred. In a day, period laws can create internalized disgust, and gender roles and heteronormativity, which emerged from colonization and patriarchy. How to reclaim this is to reach out for reform and reconstructionist Judaism authors that embrace sex positivity. I don't know how to say this, so please bear with me, but midrastic, Midrashic interpretations that center consent and connection. There's also Jewish feminist theology like Judith Plaskow, Plaskow, to help reclaim that sex is sacred under Judaism. Islam. So in the original text, the Quran discusses sex openly and positively within marriage. Mutual pleasure is encouraged. The Hadith, Prophet Muhammad spoke of foreplay, female orgasm, and sex as worship. Sources of shame became cultural taboos around virginity, honor, and women's autonomy. Within this teaching, LGBTQIA plus identities were also often suppressed. Ways to reclaim that sex is sacred within the Islamic faith. Sex-positive Muslim voices like Heba Khatib, Hebakotb, and Asra Nomani. There are Quranic rereadings centering equality and tenderness, and Islamic mysticism, Sufism, which emphasizes union and love. Hinduism. The Kama Sutra celebrates eroticism, sexuality as one of the four goals of life, kama equaling pleasure. The Tantra, which is sacred sexuality, spiritual union through erotic energy. Hinduism really starts off being one of the most sex positive religions out there. They do get influenced by sexual shame through British colonization, Victorian morality, which introduced repression. Modern caste, gender, and religious norms also layer on to restrict pleasure and introduce shame. Ways to reclaim it under Hinduism: reading the Kama Sutra, reading Tantra, and returning to ancient texts and other traditions. Gender expansive understandings in some deities like Shiva, Shakti, which has a duality of gender. Buddhism. So the original teachings of Buddhism emphasize detachment and mindfulness, not necessarily repression. There's monastic rules, which is celibacy for monks, but not all practitioners. Sources of shame were introduced from misunderstanding the desire as inherently bad and cultural overlays in some sects and locations. Ways to reclaim that sex is sacred, which within Buddhism is viewing sex as mindfulness and compassion in tantric Buddhism, and embodied practice of ethics and desire, or the dharmic sexuality. There are other indigenous and earth-based spiritualities. Many saw sex as a right, connection to earth and to ancestors. The colonial impact on this had an extraordinary effect. Christian missionaries demonized sexual freedom and repressed all sorts of gender identities and gender norms. Modern resurgence of sex as sacred is seen in many native traditions, like having a two-spirit identity. And there are many Afro-Caribbean faiths reclaiming ancestral erotic power, like Yoruba and Santeria. So let's talk about how religious shame shows up today. It shows up with internalized guilt around pleasure, masturbation, non-monogamy, or kink. Difficulty trusting oneself as a sexual being, as if anything that you're coming up with that you're interested in sexually, as long as it's consensual, that maybe you're wrong. Maybe the gender you're feeling inclined to date or marry is inappropriate. Maybe the sex act you want to do with a consenting partner is wrong, or that masturbation is also a sin. There's a fear of rejection from faith communities and LGBTQIA+ trauma and family estrangement from those who hold certain religious views, pushing out friends and family based on their orientations. All of this is part of a repeated disconnection from your own body if you were raised especially in religious shame. There is a way to heal religious sexual shame. You can do inner child work and therapy. You can do narrative rewriting. You can do sex therapy with a faith-informed lens, or even EMDR, eye movement desensitization reactivity therapy for spiritual trauma resolution. There are spiritual tools like reclaiming sacred texts through affirming theology, like the ones I listed when discussing the different religions, talking with progressive faith leaders or interfaith communities to find a way to practice spirituality that actually is sacred, and the rewriting of prayers and rituals around love, body, and pleasure. There's also somatic tools like body mapping, sacred sensuality practices, and mindfulness and breath as part of reclamation. Final thoughts. Faith and pleasure can coexist. Your sexuality and your spirituality are not enemies. They are parts of the same sacred self. Healing is possible, and you're allowed to reimagine your relationship with God, your God source, spirit, all on your own terms. You are holy. Your body is not sinful, and your pleasure is a form of prayer.